Tonight, we examine a case that once commanded national attention and then passed into the permanent record of British legal history. A single investigation, a single verdict, and a concealment so complete that it held for a full year beneath the floor of a working warehouse. The case of Harriet Lane begins in Whitechapel, London, in the autumn of 1874. Whitechapel was a district of the East End of London, a broad and crowded quarter of trade and manufacture lying east of the ancient boundary of the city, within the parish of Whitechapel and the wider borough of Tower Hamlets. It was, in that year, among the most densely populated districts of the capital, home to many tens of thousands of residents drawn from the labouring and artisan classes, together with a substantial population of small tradesmen, shopkeepers and manufacturers. The great thoroughfare of Whitechapel Road ran through the heart of it, a wide and busy artery lined with shops, warehouses, public houses and workshops, along which passed a constant traffic of carts, cabs, omnibuses and foot passengers from before dawn until late into the night. The character of the district was industrial and commercial rather than genteel. Behind the frontages of the main road stood a dense network of yards, alleys and courts, in which were carried on innumerable small trades. There were brush makers, cabinet makers, tailors, boot and shoe makers, sugar refiners, and dealers in every kind of goods. Warehousing was common, for the district lay close to the docks and to the markets of the city, and premises that fronted the street, as shops frequently extended backward into storerooms and manufacturing spaces of considerable size. Gas lighting illuminated the principal streets after dark, though the courts behind them remained dim. The air carried the smells of the trades of tanning and refining, and the smoke of countless domestic and industrial fires. Into this district, and into this year, the life of Harriet Louisa Lane had been drawn from a very different beginning. She had not been born to the East End, nor to the labouring poor. Her origins lay some miles to the north of the capital, in the town of Waltham Cross in the county of Hertfordshire, in comfortable and respectable circumstances that would later stand in sharp contrast to the manner of her death. The distance between the quiet Hertfordshire town of her upbringing and the warehouse floor of Whitechapel Road was, in every sense, the measure of her story. Harriet Louisa Lane was born in or about the year 1852 at Waltham Cross, Hertfordshire, the daughter of a respectable and comfortably situated family. Her father was employed as a gas fitter, a position of trust and steady income that placed the family within the solid and self-respecting lower middle class of the period. The household was one of decent means and settled prospects. She was raised in circumstances that afforded her an education suitable to her station and expectations of a respectable future, whether in a trade proper to a young woman of her class or in a suitable marriage. The record describes her as a young woman of lively temperament, bright and pretty, with a marked taste for the theatrical and an inclination toward the stage. Such ambitions were regarded in a family of her father's position as unsuitable and even hazardous, for the theatrical life carried associations that respectable families of the mid-Victorian period viewed with considerable suspicion. Whatever encouragement she may have received in these interests, the expectation held for her was of a settled and conventional path. In accordance with that expectation, she was apprenticed to a milliner. Millinery and dressmaking were among the most common of the respectable trades open to young women of her class in the middle decades of the 19th century. The work required skill, application, and a degree of taste, and it offered a young woman a means of honest and genteel employment. An apprenticeship in the trade was a recognised and proper course for a daughter of a family such as hers, and it indicates the respectability of the circumstances in which she was raised. The surviving record is thin upon the details of her childhood and her family beyond these particulars. It does not establish with certainty the number of her brothers and sisters, nor the specifics of her schooling, nor the ordinary incidents of her early years. What the record does establish is the essential character of her origins. She came from a respectable household of modest comfort. She was raised with the expectation of a decent and conventional life. She possessed a lively disposition and ambitions that reached beyond the narrow bounds set for young women of her station. Her family, in later years, regarded her as having thrown away good prospects. This was the view of those who had known her before her association with the man who would end her life, and it reflects the social distance she was held to have travelled. The daughter of a gasfitter, apprenticed to a milliner, and raised in respectable Hertfordshire comfort, had, by the age of 22, become a kept woman, living under a false name in the lodgings of a married tradesman, the mother of 2 children born outside marriage. Her fall, it must be stated plainly, was a social one, and not a criminal one. She had broken no law and injured no person. She had departed from the narrow code of respectability that governed the lives of women of her class, and in the eyes of that code she had ruined herself. But she remained, throughout, the victim in this account, and never its author. If you value cases told this way, drawn from records rather than speculation, subscribe to the channel. And if you would like to read more of these stories, The Forgotten Women of Victorian Britain is linked in the top line of the description. Now back to the record. The circumstances that carried Harriet Lane from the respectable expectations of her upbringing to the warehouse in Whitechapel Road began in the year 1871. It was in that year, when she was about 19 years of age, that she first became acquainted with Henry Wainwright. He was a married man, established in trade, some years her senior, and possessed of a comfortable home and a business of good standing. He conducted a brush manufactory in the East End, an enterprise of respectable size that employed a number of hands and that furnished him with the outward marks of prosperity and standing in the district. The acquaintance between them developed into an intimate association. Harriet became his mistress. Whatever the manner of their first meeting, and the record does not preserve it in detail, the relationship that followed was not a brief or casual one, but a settled arrangement of some permanence. Wainwright established her in lodgings and undertook to provide for her maintenance. She lived under the name of Mrs. Percy King, an assumed name that concealed the irregular nature of the connection and lent her the appearance of a respectable married woman living apart from her husband. The maintenance he provided was substantial. He allowed her the sum of £5 a week, a considerable amount by the standards of the period, and one that marked her clearly as a kept woman rather than the object of a passing liaison. £5 a week represented an income greater than that earned by many respectable working men in the district, and it permitted Harriet to live in a manner of some comfort. The arrangement bore all the marks of a settled second establishment, maintained by a man of means alongside his lawful household and quite separate from it. In the course of the association, she bore him 2 children, both daughters. The existence of these children deepened her dependence upon Wainwright and bound her more closely to him, for she now had not only herself to maintain, but 2 young daughters who relied entirely upon the provision he made. The children were cared for with the assistance of a friend, and Harriet's circumstances for a period remained those of a woman kept in reasonable comfort by a man of business who honoured his obligations to her. This arrangement, however, depended entirely upon the continued prosperity of Henry Wainwright's affairs, and by the year 1874 those affairs had fallen into serious disorder. His business, which had once furnished the comfortable income out of which he maintained both his lawful home and his second establishment, had begun to decline. Debts accumulated, the enterprise moved steadily toward insolvency, and the resources upon which Harriet depended grew correspondingly straitened. The generous allowance of £5 a week could no longer be sustained, and the sums he provided to her diminished. the reduction of her maintenance placed Harriet Lane in a position of increasing difficulty. She had no independent means. She had 2 young children to support. She had removed herself by the manner of her life from the respectable connections of her family and from the trade in which she had been apprenticed. Her entire subsistence rested upon a man whose capacity and willingness to provide were both now failing. As the allowance shrank, her circumstances became precarious, and she found herself, in effect, an encumbrance upon a man whose fortunes were collapsing and who had every reason to wish himself free of the obligation she represented. In this situation, Harriet pressed Wainwright for money. She required the means to live and to maintain the children, and she looked to him, as she had always looked to him, to furnish it. When the sums were not forthcoming in the measure she needed, she resorted to the one form of pressure available to a woman in her position. She threatened to make herself and the children known to his wife and to his family. She threatened, in short, to expose the double life he had so carefully maintained, to bring the concealed second establishment into the light, and to destroy the respectable standing upon which his position in the district rested. To a man in Henry Wainwright's circumstances, this was a threat of the gravest kind. His public character was that of a respectable, married tradesman, a chapel-goer, and a figure of some standing in the community. The revelation of a mistress living under a false name, and of 2 children born outside his marriage, would have ruined that character utterly. Coming at a moment when his business was already failing and his creditors already pressing, the threat of exposure struck at the last remaining asset he possessed, which was his reputation. The convergence of financial collapse and the danger of disgrace formed the whole of the motive that the prosecution would afterward lay before the court. The threat of exposure, however, was one that Henry Wainwright had no intention of permitting to be carried out. What passed through his mind in the weeks and months of 1874, as his creditors pressed and his mistress pressed, and the 2 dangers closed upon him together, the record does not disclose. What the record does establish is the course of action upon which he resolved, and the day upon which he carried it into effect. That day was Friday, the 11th of September, 1874. On that morning, Harriet Lane dressed herself for an appointment. She put on a grey dress fastened with buttons of jet, a bonnet, and a cape. These particulars of her dress would afterward assume an importance that no one could have foreseen upon that ordinary Friday, for they would in time become the means by which what remained of her was identified. She was, on that day, about 22 years of age, the mother of 2 young daughters, living under a name that was not her own, dependent upon a man whose fortunes were failing and whom she had lately threatened with ruin. Before she departed, she left her 2 children in the care of a friend named Ellen Wilmore. This was a customary arrangement, for Ellen Wilmore was known to her and had assisted with the care of the children before. Harriet gave no indication that the day was other than ordinary. She said that she was going to meet Wainwright, and she left the children with her friend, as she had done on other occasions, expecting, so far as anyone could afterward determine, to return to them in the usual way. She then made her way to Wainwright's premises, at number 215 Whitechapel Road. She was never seen alive again by any person who afterward gave account of her. She did not return to collect her children. She did not return to her lodgings. From the evening of the 11th of September, 1874, Harriet Louisa Lane simply ceased to appear in the world she had inhabited, and the silence that followed her disappearance was, for a full year, filled only by the false explanations of the man she'd gone to meet. The premises to which she'd gone belonged to Henry Wainwright, and something must now be set down of the man himself, for he is the engine of all that followed. Henry Wainwright was a brush manufacturer who carried on business at premises in Whitechapel Road, principally at number 215, with associated premises at number 84. He was, to all outward appearance, a model of the respectable East End tradesman. He was a married man, with a family and a comfortable home. He conducted a business of good standing that employed a number of workpeople. He was known and liked in the district, and he moved with ease among its respectable and church-connected society. His public character was, indeed, one of unusual visibility and repute. He was a chapel sidesman, a man who took a part in the affairs of his place of worship and who bore the marks of religious respectability. He was known as a public lecturer of some popularity, and he had acquired a particular reputation as an amateur reciter, admired for his readings from the works of Charles Dickens. To hear Henry Wainwright deliver a passage from Dickens was, in the East End of the early 1870s, a recognised entertainment, and it earned him a measure of local celebrity. He was, in the eyes of those who knew him in this public aspect, a sociable, cultivated, and thoroughly respectable man. Beneath this public character lay the concealed reality of his affairs. He maintained the second household of Harriet Lane and their 2 children entirely apart from his lawful home, an arrangement that consumed a substantial part of his income and that depended for its safety upon absolute secrecy. At the same time, his business, the source of all his prosperity, had entered upon a decline that was carrying it steadily toward bankruptcy. The comfortable and admired tradesman was in truth a man living beyond his means, sustaining 2 establishments upon a failing income, and increasingly unable to meet the obligations of either. In the concealment that followed the crime, Henry Wainwright was assisted by his brother, Thomas Wainwright. Thomas played a part of some particularity in the deception that was constructed to explain Harriet's disappearance. He undertook to impersonate a man named Edward Freake, a fictitious figure who was to serve as the supposed companion of Harriet's supposed flight. By lending his person and his hand to this invention, Thomas Wainwright made himself party to the concealment of the crime, and he would in due course answer for it before the court as an accessory after the fact. The motive that governed Henry Wainwright's conduct was, as the prosecution would afterward contend, the convergence of 2 pressures that admitted of no other escape as he saw it. His business was failing and could not be saved. His mistress threatened to expose him and could not, as he supposed, be silenced by any lesser means, his resources being no longer equal to buying her continued discretion. In the destruction of Harriet Lane, he saw the removal of the one danger that remained within his power to remove. His guilt in the matter was established at trial beyond serious question, and it may be stated here as fact, for he was convicted upon evidence and hanged upon the sentence of the court. Upon the evening of the 11th of September, 1874, within the premises at 215 Whitechapel Road, Henry Wainwright killed Harriet Lane. She was shot. The record establishes that the injuries were inflicted swiftly and were rapidly fatal, and no more than this need be set down concerning the manner of her death. There were no witnesses to the act. She had come alone to the premises of a man she trusted to provide for her, and in those premises her life was ended. Having killed her, Wainwright disposed of the body within the premises themselves. He buried her beneath the floorboards of the warehouse in the very building in which his business was carried on. She was placed in the ground, still dressed as she had come, in the grey dress with its jet buttons, the bonnet and the cape. The concealment was, in its way, a work of great audacity, for it did not remove the body to any distant or hidden place, but kept it where the killer himself continued daily to come and go, beneath the feet of the men who worked the trade above. There now began the second, and in some respects the more remarkable phase of Wainwright's design, which was the manufacture of an explanation for Harriet's absence. He could not permit her disappearance to occasion inquiry, for inquiry would in time reach the premises in which she lay. He therefore set about to persuade all who had known her that she had left of her own accord, and he constructed for this purpose a false account of an elopement. The account he gave was that Harriet had formed an attachment to another man and had gone away with him. The man he named was Edward Freake, a person who had no existence save in the invention of the Wainwright brothers. To lend this fiction the appearance of reality, it was not sufficient merely to speak the name. There had to be some evidence of the man, some sign that he existed and that Harriet was indeed in his company. This was the office that Thomas Wainwright undertook, in impersonating the fictitious freak and in lending his hand to the correspondence that was to make the elopement credible. The instrument chosen for the deception was in part the electric telegraph. The telegraph had by the 1870s become an established feature of commercial and private communication, a means by which messages could be sent swiftly across the country and delivered as tangible slips of paper into the hands of the recipient. A telegram bore an air of authenticity, for it appeared to originate from a particular place at a particular time, and to carry the words of a real and present sender. Telegrams were accordingly dispatched in the name of Edward Freak, conveying the impression that Harriet and her supposed companion were together and were moving about in the manner of two persons who had gone away as lovers. By these means, the disappearance of Harriet Lane was furnished with an explanation that satisfied, for a time, those who might otherwise have pressed for her. Her family and her friends were given to understand that she had abandoned her respectable connections altogether and had run off to the continent with a man named Freak. It was an explanation that fitted cruelly the very reputation she had acquired, for a woman who had already left her family to become a kept mistress might the more readily be believed to have left her keeper for another man. The fiction traded upon her fallen character to conceal her murder. And so the months passed, through the remainder of 1874 and into and through the whole of 1875, the brush business continued to be carried on at 215 Whitechapel Road. Workmen came and went, goods were manufactured and sold. Henry Wainwright moved among his employees and his customers and his chapel and his lecture engagements, maintaining throughout the appearance of the respectable tradesman he had always seemed to be, while beneath the floor of his own warehouse the body of Harriet Lane remained where he had placed it. For a full year the concealment held, and it might have held longer, still had not the collapse of the very business that housed the grave forced Wainwright at last to disturb it. The bankruptcy of Henry Wainwright, so long approaching, at length arrived, and with it came the necessity of giving up the premises. When a business fails and its affairs pass into the hands of creditors, the premises it has occupied must be surrendered, cleared and made ready for others. Wainwright could no longer retain the warehouse at 215 Whitechapel Road, and the prospect of its passing out of his control presented him with a danger he could no longer defer. The grave he had made beneath the floorboards would not remain his secret once other men held the keys and the right to take up the boards. What he had concealed for a year, he was now compelled to move. It was upon the 11th of September, 1875, almost precisely a year to the day, since Harriet Lane had walked into the premises and had not walked out, that Wainwright set about the removal of the remains. He took up what he had buried and made it ready for carriage, wrapping it in parcels of American cloth, a waterproofed fabric of the period, commonly used for coverings and packing. The condition of what he recovered after a year beneath the floor was such as that interval would produce, and the record establishes no more than that the remains were divided into parcels for the purpose of removal. No further particular of their state need be set down. For the work of carrying the parcels away, Wainwright required assistance, and here he made the error that undid him. He turned to a man named Alfred Stokes, who had formerly been in his employ. Stokes was a working man, an ordinary labourer of the district, and Wainwright appears to have supposed that he would carry a burden and ask no questions, as a paid man might be expected to do. He asked Stokes to help him move the parcels from the premises, and Stokes agreed to lend his hands to the task. Wainwright did not tell Stokes what the parcels contained, and he took such care as he could that the man should not learn it. But the parcels were heavy, and there was about them something that awoke the suspicion of the man who carried them. While Wainwright was absent for a time, gone to fetch a cab in which the parcels might be conveyed, Stokes was left with the burden, and his suspicion so far mastered him that he opened one of the parcels to see what it was that he had been set to carry. What he saw within it was human remains. The discovery placed Alfred Stokes in a position of sudden and extreme difficulty. He was a working man of no authority, alone with the evidence of a murder, and the man responsible was at that moment returning with a cab. Stokes did not confront Wainwright, nor did he attempt to seize or detain him, for he had not the means to do so. He concealed what he knew, allowed the parcels to be loaded, and resolved instead to follow, so that the crime he had uncovered should not simply be carried away into the streets and lost. Wainwright returned with the cab. The parcels were placed within it, and there was in the cab, besides, a woman named Alice Day, an acquaintance of Wainwright who had no knowledge whatever of what the parcels held and no part in any wrongdoing. She was entirely innocent of the matter, and it must be stated plainly that she was in no way concerned in the crime or its concealment. She was released without charge once the facts were known, and her presence in the cab was nothing more than an innocent circumstance of that day. The cab set off, and Alfred Stokes set off after it on foot. What followed was one of the most extraordinary pursuits in the criminal history of Victorian London. A working man, without conveyance of his own, ran after a cab through the streets of the East End, keeping it in his sight, calling out as he went for the police. The cab passed westward toward the river, and Stokes followed it across London Bridge, over the Thames, and into the Borough upon the southern side, running and shouting through the traffic of one of the busiest crossings in the capital. For a considerable distance, Stokes was unable to obtain the assistance he sought. He called to constables and to passers-by, and his cries were not at first heeded, for a labouring man running and shouting after a cab was a sight that might mean many things, and few were disposed to act upon it. He persisted nonetheless. He did not abandon the pursuit when his calls went unanswered, nor when the distance and the exertion told upon him. He kept the cab in view across the bridge and into the streets beyond, and at length his persistence found its reward. Constables were at last brought to act, and the cab was stopped. It was halted at the door of a place known as the Hen and Chickens, an ironmongery in the borough that was leased by Wainwright's brother. There the parcels were examined, and there the nature of their contents was made plain to the officers, and the whole design that had held for a year was in an instant undone by the stubbornness of a single working man. Faced with the officers and the opened parcels, Henry Wainwright attempted to escape by the means that had served him in other difficulties, which was money. He offered the constables a bribe, proposing to pay them the sum of £200 if they would let him go. £200 was a very large sum, several years' wages for a labouring man, and the offer was a measure both of Wainwright's desperation and of his continued belief that most difficulties might be bought off. The officers did not accept it. Wainwright was taken into custody, and his brother Thomas was in due course arrested also. Thus, on the 11th of September, 1875, the crime that had been committed on the 11th of September, 1874, came to light. Not through the ordinary processes of detection, not through any suspicion that had been nursed for a year, but through the accident of a heavy parcel, the curiosity of a working man, and a foot pursuit across London Bridge. The investigation that now opened had, in a sense, its principal fact already in hand, for the remains had been taken in the very act of removal, and the man who had removed them was in custody. What remained was to establish, by the regular means of the law, who the dead woman was, how she had died, and the guilt of those who had concealed her. The investigation was accordingly opened in form. The remains were taken into the charge of the authorities, and officers proceeded to secure the several elements of the case. The parcels of American cloth were preserved as evidence. The premises at 215 Whitechapel Road were examined, and the place beneath the floorboards, where the body had lain for a year, was identified as the grave. The physical connection between the remains, the parcels, the premises, and the man in custody was thus established at the outset, and it furnished the foundation upon which the case would be built. Central to the investigation was the identification of the dead woman, for a body concealed for a year and divided for removal does not readily declare its name. Here the clothing assumed the importance that had been fixed upon it, all unknowing, upon the morning of the 11th of September, 1874. The grey dress with its buttons of jet, together with the other articles of clothing recovered with the remains, furnished the means by which those who had known Harriet Lane could identify what had been found as her. The dress she had put on to keep her appointment became, a year later, the proof of who she was. The officers took statements from those who could speak to Harriet's disappearance and to the false account that had been given of it. Ellen Wilmore, the friend with whom Harriet had left her 2 children upon the day she went to meet Wainwright, could speak to the circumstances of that last departure and to the fact that Harriet had never returned for the children she had left in her care. Others who had known Harriet and who had been told the tale of her flight with Edward Freake could now set that tale against the discovery of her body beneath the warehouse floor and expose it for the invention it had always been. The false elopement, which had for a year served to explain Harriet's absence, now became itself a principal item of evidence against the men who had constructed it. The telegram sent in the name of Edward Freake, the impersonation undertaken by Thomas Wainwright, the whole apparatus of the manufactured flight could be traced and laid before the authorities as proof not of innocence, but of a deliberate and sustained concealment. A man does not manufacture the elopement of a woman he has not harmed. The very elaborateness of the deception testified to the guilt it had been designed to hide. The investigation, then, proceeded from a position of unusual strength. The remains had been seized in transit, the place of concealment identified, the identity of the victim established through her clothing, and the men responsible taken into custody within hours of the discovery. The elaborate fiction of the elopement, so far from protecting its authors, now stood as evidence of the very concealment it had been made to serve. Statements were taken, the physical articles were preserved, and the case was made ready for the medical examination of the remains and for the coroner's inquest that must precede any trial. The medical examination of the remains formed a necessary part of the proceedings, for the law required that the cause of death be established by competent authority before any charge of murder could be sustained. The remains recovered from beneath the warehouse floor and from the parcels of American cloth were examined by medical men, whose office it was to determine, so far as the condition of the remains permitted, how Harriet Lane had come by her death. The examination was conducted with the particularity that a charge of murder demanded, and its findings were afterward given in evidence before the court. The medical evidence established that death had been caused by violence and was consistent with the discharge of a firearm. The injuries were of a kind that would have proved rapidly fatal, and there was nothing in the findings to suggest any cause of death other than deliberate violence inflicted by another hand. It is sufficient to record that the medical men determined the death to have been a violent one, that it accorded with the account of a shooting, and that the graphic particulars of the examination need not be rehearsed. The purpose of the examination was to fix the cause of death, and that purpose it served. The examination of the remains also bore upon the question of identity, for the medical men could speak to such physical particulars as the remains disclosed, and these, taken together with the clothing, confirmed that what had been recovered were the remains of a woman answering to Harriet Lane. The clothing had furnished the first and readiest means of identification, and the physical examination supported it. The two together placed the identity of the victim beyond reasonable question, and this was of the first importance, for without a confident identification of the dead woman, there could be no prosecution for her murder. Documentary material connected with the case afterward passed into the keeping of the Royal College of Surgeons, where matter relating to the case was preserved among the college's holdings. This was in keeping with the practice of the period, by which materials of medical and forensic interest arising from notable cases were retained for the purposes of instruction, and record. The preservation of such material reflected the significance that the case had assumed and the attention that had been given to the medical questions it raised. Beyond this, the particulars of the examination remain matters of the record and require no further recital. With the cause of death established and the identity of the victim confirmed, the case passed to the coroner, before whom an inquest was convened. The coroner's inquest was, in the procedure of Victorian England, the first formal legal inquiry into a death believed to be unnatural. It was the office of the coroner, sitting with a jury, to determine how the deceased had come by death, and, where the death was found to be the result of a criminal act, to name, if it could, the person responsible. The inquest thus stood as the gateway through which a suspected murder passed toward trial. The inquest into the death of Harriet Lane was held upon the remains recovered from the premises in Whitechapel Road. The coroner heard evidence bearing upon the identity of the deceased, upon the cause of her death, and upon the circumstances in which the remains had been found and seized. The witnesses who had knowledge of these matters were called before him, and their evidence was taken upon oath and recorded, that it might form part of the material upon which any subsequent trial would proceed. Before the coroner's jury were laid the several facts that the investigation had gathered. There was the evidence of the discovery of the remains and of the pursuit that had brought them to light. There was the evidence identifying the remains through the clothing and the physical particulars as those of Harriet Lane. There was the medical evidence establishing that death had been caused by violence consistent with a shooting. And there was the evidence of the concealment, of the year that had passed, and of the false account of the elopement that had been used to explain the absence of the deceased. Upon this evidence, the coroner's jury returned its finding. The jury determined that Harriet Lane had been wilfully murdered, and the finding of the inquest was directed against Henry Wainwright as the person responsible for her death. The inquest thus performed its office, establishing in the form the law required that the death had been a murder and identifying the man to be answered for it. Thomas Wainwright's part in the concealment likewise fell to be answered, and the brothers were committed to stand their trial before the Central Criminal Court. The committal of the Wainwrights carried the case from the preliminary inquiries into the highest criminal court of the metropolis. The finding of the coroner's jury, the depositions of the witnesses, and the physical evidence were transmitted to the proper authorities, and the matter was set down for trial at the Old Bailey. What had begun with a heavy parcel and a working man's suspicion in the streets of the borough had now become one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings of the decade, and the whole apparatus of the law was assembled to try it. The trial of Henry Wainwright and Thomas Wainwright commenced at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, in London, in November of 1875. It was a lengthy trial, closely and fully reported in the newspapers of the day, which followed its every stage for a public whose appetite for the case was very great. The presiding judge was the Lord Chief Justice, Sir Alexander Cockburn, who occupied the highest place upon the bench, and whose conduct of the trial lent it the fullest gravity that the law could bestow. Henry Wainwright stood charged with the wilful murder of Harriet Lane. Thomas Wainwright stood charged as an accessory after the fact, upon the ground of the part he had taken in the concealment of the crime and in the manufacture of the false account of the elopement. Both men pleaded not guilty, and the trial proceeded upon that plea, the burden lying upon the prosecution to establish the guilt of each beyond reasonable doubt to the satisfaction of the jury. The case for the prosecution was built upon the several elements that the investigation and the inquest had assembled, arranged into a connected account of the crime and its concealment. The prosecution set before the jury the relationship between Wainwright and the deceased, the maintenance of Harriet Lane as his mistress under the name of Mrs. Percy King, the birth of the two children, the decline of Wainwright's affairs, the reduction of the allowance, and the threats of exposure that furnished the motive. It then traced the disappearance of Harriet upon the 11th of September, 1874, and the year of concealment that followed. Central to the prosecution's case was the manufactured elopement, for it supplied not only the explanation the killer had given, but the proof of his consciousness of guilt. The prosecution laid before the jury the false account that Harriet had gone away with Edward Freake, the fictitious character of that person, the impersonation undertaken by Thomas Wainwright, and the telegrams dispatched in Freake's name to give the fiction substance. The whole elaborate deception was shown to be the deliberate work of the two brothers, contrived to conceal a murder and to prevent the inquiry that must otherwise have followed the disappearance of the dead woman. The prosecution then brought before the jury the discovery of the crime, and here the evidence of Alfred Stokes was of the first importance. Stokes gave his account of the removal of the parcels, of the suspicion that had moved him to open one of them, of what he had found within it, and of the pursuit he had made across London Bridge into the borough, calling for the police as he ran. His evidence carried the case from the concealment to the seizure of the remains, and it was upon his stubbornness that the whole discovery had turned. The working man whose curiosity had defeated a year of concealment stood in the witness box and told the court plainly what he had done. To the evidence of Stokes was added that of the constables who had at length stopped the cab at the door of the Hen and Chickens, and who had examined the parcels and taken the men into custody. The officers spoke to the seizure of the remains, to the arrest and to the attempt that Henry Wainwright had made to bribe them, offering the sum of £200 to be let go. The offer of the bribe was laid before the jury as evidence of Wainwright's consciousness of guilt, for an innocent man has no occasion to purchase his liberty from the officers of the law. The prosecution laid before the jury the evidence of identification, by which the remains had been shown to be those of Harriet Lane. The clothing recovered with the remains, and in particular the grey dress with its buttons of jet, was produced and spoken to by those who had known Harriet, and who could identify what she had worn. The medical evidence establishing the cause of death was given, fixing the death as a violent one, consistent with a shooting, and the connection between the remains, the premises at 215 Whitechapel Road, and the man in the dock was established through the whole chain of the concealment, the removal, and the seizure. Against this body of evidence the defence was set to contend, and the task before it was a heavy one. The defence sought to raise doubt upon the several points on which the prosecution's case depended, questioning the certainty of the identification and the sufficiency of the proof that connected Henry Wainwright to the death rather than merely to the removal of the remains. The defence of Thomas Wainwright rested upon the contention that his part had been that of a man drawn into the affairs of his brother, and it sought to distinguish his conduct from a knowing participation in the concealment of a murder. But the accumulated weight of the evidence bore heavily against both men. The relationship, the motive, the disappearance, the year of concealment beneath the premises the killer himself occupied, the manufactured elopement with its false telegrams, the seizure of the remains in the very act of removal, the identification by the clothing, the medical proof of a violent death, and the attempted bribe, all combined into an account that admitted of no innocent explanation. The trial occupied a number of days, and its every stage was reported at length to a public that followed it with an attention given to few cases of the century. The Lord Chief Justice, Sir Alexander Cockburn, summed up the evidence to the jury, setting before them the several matters they were to weigh, and the law that governed their deliberations. The jury then retired to consider its verdict. Upon its return, the jury pronounced Henry Wainwright guilty of the wilful murder of Harriet Lane. Against Thomas Wainwright, the jury returned a verdict of guilty as an accessory after the fact, upon the ground of the part he had taken in the concealment of the crime. The verdict brought the trial to its conclusion and left only the passing of sentence. The court had before it two men, the one convicted of murder and the other of the concealment of it, and the law prescribed for each a very different consequence. For the crime of wilful murder, the law of England admitted of but one sentence, and the court proceeded to pronounce it upon Henry Wainwright. Upon Thomas Wainwright, whose offence was the lesser one of an accessory after the fact, the court was to pass a sentence of penal servitude. The court proceeded to sentencing. Henry Wainwright was sentenced to death. The sentence was pronounced in the form the law required, and it left no discretion and admitted of no mitigation, the crime being murder and the verdict guilty. Thomas Wainwright was sentenced to 7 years penal servitude, the punishment appointed for the part he had taken as an accessory after the fact in the concealment of his brother's crime. The two brothers, who had together contrived the year-long deception, were thus to be parted, the one to the scaffold and the other to the long servitude of the convict. The passing of the sentences did not diminish the attention that the case commanded. Throughout the whole of 1875, the newspapers had followed the matter from the discovery in September to the trial in November, and the sentence that closed it, and the public interest was of the greatest. The case had every element that fixed the attention of the Victorian public. There was the respectable tradesman with the hidden second life, the mistress concealed beneath a false name, the body kept for a year beneath a working warehouse, the manufactured flight with its false telegrams, and the extraordinary pursuit by which an ordinary man had brought the whole design to ruin. There was, in the aftermath of the trial, one matter that stirred a particular feeling among the public, and it concerned Alfred Stokes, the working man whose suspicion and whose stubborn pursuit had solved the case, and without whom the crime might never have come to light at all, was awarded for his part the sum of £30. The smallness of the reward was widely felt to be an insult. The public that had followed the case understood well enough that Stokes had done what neither the police nor any other person had done, that he had run across London calling for help that was slow to come, and that he had persisted when it would have been easier by far to let the cab go. That such service should be recompensed with £30 was a matter of open complaint, and it remains a documented strand of the aftermath of the case. The sentence of death pronounced upon Henry Wainwright was carried into effect at Newgate Jail upon the 21st of December, 1875. Newgate, standing hard by the Old Bailey in which he had been tried, was the place appointed for the execution of those condemned within the metropolis, and it was there, some weeks after the close of his trial, that the sentence was executed. The execution brought to its end the life of a man who had for years maintained two existences, the respectable tradesman and lecturer known to the district, and the concealed keeper and murderer of Harriet Lane. The execution was attended by the customary apparatus of such occasions, and it furnished, as executions of note then did, the material for the printed broadsides that were sold about the streets. Sheets bearing the title of the execution and confession of Henry Wainwright were printed and sold after the fashion of the period to a public eager for such matter, and examples of these broadsides were preserved and are held among the collections that record the case. The printed sheet, hawked in the streets in the days about the execution, was the form in which the ordinary public of 1875 took its account of the ending of the affair. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1875. The case became part of the national record. It has not left. That is where the record of the first case ends. We turn now to a second story, quieter than the first and far less remembered, one that unfolded years later and on the other side of the river, in a district where a poor woman's death could be written down, filed and forgotten within the span of a single afternoon, and where the same question that no inquest could answer at first was very nearly never asked at all. The case of Matilda Clover begins in Lambeth, London, in the autumn of 1891. Lambeth was a densely populated district on the south bank of the River Thames, directly across the water from the older and more famous quarters of the capital, and by the last decade of the 19th century, it had become one of the most crowded working districts in the whole of London. The riverside frontage was given over to wharves, timber yards, potteries and manufactories, and behind them the streets ran back in long terraces of small brick houses, many of them let room by room to families and lodgers who could afford nothing more. The population of the wider borough numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and the greater part of that number lived by daily labour in trades that offered no security and wages that left no margin. It was a district of public houses, of pawnbrokers, of lodging houses, and of streets that filled with traffic by day and emptied uneasily by night. The Lambeth Road, where Matilda Clover lodged, ran through the heart of this district. It was a thoroughfare of ordinary respectability and ordinary poverty mixed together, lined with houses that had once been the homes of single families and were now, for the most part, divided among several. Gas lamps lit the pavements after dark, and the light they gave was thin and yellow, and did not reach far into the courts and passages that opened off the main road. The river was close at hand, and with it came the damp that settled over the low-lying ground in the colder months, and the fog that rose from the water and drifted through the streets on still nights. It was a place where a great many people lived within a small compass, and where a stranger passing through after dark drew little attention, for strangers passed through it constantly. Into this district, in the autumn of that year, the life of Matilda Clover had come to rest. She was 27 years of age. The documentary record keeps little of her early life, and what little it keeps must be set down plainly, for it is thin in the way that the records of poor women of her class and her time are almost always thin. She had not been born to any station that would have produced letters, portraits, or the careful notice of her neighbours, and so the years before she came to Lambeth Road survive only in fragments and in the barest outline. What can be established is this: she was a woman of the poorer working class of South London, who lived, as so many did, from one week to the next, without property, without savings, and without the protection of a settled household. She had a young son, a boy of about 2 years, whom she was raising alone. The child's father had not remained with her, and by the autumn of 1891 she was, in effect, an abandoned wife or common law partner, left to provide for herself and for the boy by whatever means the district afforded her. Those means were precarious. She earned her living in part through sex work, and in part through whatever other employment or assistance came to hand, and she lived, as a result, at the very margin of the district's economy, where a single week of misfortune could unsettle everything. The record establishes too that she was a woman who drank. This fact is set down not as a judgment upon her, but because it bears directly upon what followed, and because it was, in the end, the fact upon which the whole early failure of the case would turn. Her drinking was known in the house where she lodged, and in the streets where she was known, and it was a fact of her life that could be, and was, used against her after her death. For it made a certain kind of death easy to explain, and easy to certify, and easy to close. A woman known to drink, found dead after a night of illness, could be entered in the record as a woman who had died of drink, and no one would think to look further. That is precisely what would happen. She lodged in a house on the Lambeth Road, in which a servant girl named Lucy Rose was employed. The household was of the ordinary kind for the district, a house in which rooms were let, and in which a servant kept the place and answered the door, and knew, in the manner of servants in such houses, a good deal of the comings and goings of those who lodged there. Lucy Rose would later prove to be a witness of unusual value, for she was present in the house on the last night of Matilda Clover's life, and she saw the man who called, and she remembered him with a precision that would matter enormously when at last there was someone prepared to ask. The record of Matilda Clover's daily life in this period is, again, sparse. She kept her room, she cared for her son, as she was able, she went out into the district in the evenings, and she returned. Her existence was of the kind that leaves few traces while it continues and becomes legible only at its end. when the machinery of inquiry, coming late, gathers up what the neighbours and the servants and the lodgers can recall. The record keeps her age, her child, her lodging, her manner of earning, and her drinking. Beyond these it keeps little, and where it is silent, it is better to say so plainly than to fill the silence with invention. The years before Lambeth Road remain, for the most part, unrecorded. What may be said with confidence is that she had arrived, by the autumn of 1891, at a condition of settled poverty that was in no way remarkable in the district in which she lived. Thousands of women in Lambeth and in the districts around it lived, as she lived, at the margin, without security, raising children without the fathers of those children, earning their bread by whatever means remained to them. Her circumstances were ordinary. It was only the manner of her death, and the long delay before that death was understood for what it was, that would lift her name out of the general obscurity of the district's poor and enter it, at last, into the record of a criminal trial. The events that ended her life gathered over the course of a single week in October of 1891, though at the time no one in the household understood them as events at all. They understood only that a lodger had fallen ill in the night and had died the next morning, and that such things happened, and that there was nothing in it to remark upon beyond the ordinary sorrow of a death in the house. The understanding that a crime had occurred would come much later, and from an unexpected quarter, and by then Matilda Clover would have lain in the ground for the better part of a year. To understand what happened on the last night of her life, it is necessary to set down first the movements of the man who came to the door, for it was he who brought the means of her death with him, and it was he whom Lucy Rose would remember. The man was, at the time, entirely unknown to the household. He was a caller such as might come to the door of any lodging-house in the district, and there was, in the fact of his coming, nothing to distinguish that evening from any other. It was only afterward, when the description of him was set beside the manner of the death, that his appearance took on the weight it would come to carry in the record. On the evening of the 20th of October, 1891, Matilda Clover brought a man home to her lodgings on the Lambeth Road. The household observed him, and the servant girl Lucy Rose observed him with particular care, and the description that survives is unusually precise for a caller at a lodging-house door. He was a tall man, heavily built about the face, by a large moustache, and he wore a silk top hat. His dress and his bearing marked him as a man of some means, a man of the professional or comfortable classes, and not a man of the district. He was, in short, the kind of visitor whose appearance in such a house was noteworthy precisely because it was out of place, and it was this that fixed him in the memory of those who saw him. He did not remain in the house as an ordinary caller might. Before he departed, he gave to Matilda Clover a quantity of pills, and he gave her instructions concerning them. She was to take them, he told her, before she went to bed. This detail, the pills and the instruction attached to them, would later become the central fact of the case, but on the evening itself it passed without alarm, as the ordinary transaction of a man who had the manner of a doctor and the dress of a gentleman. She kept the pills. In due course that night she took them, as she had been told to do. What followed came in the small hours of the morning of the 21st of October. The household, which had settled for the night, was woken by the sound of Matilda Clover's screams. She had been seized by violent convulsions, and the illness that took her was sudden and severe and unmistakable to those who heard it. The servant girl and the others in the house came to her, and through the remaining hours of the night she suffered greatly, and no measure that those about her could take brought her any relief. She died at approximately 8:30 that morning. The cause of her suffering, in the plain understanding of the household, was unknown. The cause, in fact, was strychnine, administered in the pills she had been given, But this would not be established for the better part of a year. In the immediate aftermath of the death, the household understood the matter in the only terms available to it. A lodger known to drink had been taken ill in the night and had died in the morning, and the illness, dreadful as it had been to witness, admitted of a ready explanation. It was attributed to drink. A woman who was known to take more than was good for her had, in the common understanding of the house and of the district, suffered the consequences of that habit and had died of them. There was grief in the house, but there was no alarm, for there seemed nothing in the death to occasion alarm. The certification of the death followed this understanding, and it is here that the case records its first and gravest failure. The death was entered as arising from natural causes, from the effects of drink, and upon that certification the matter was closed. No suspicion attached to the caller who had come to the door on the evening of the 20th. No question was raised concerning the pills he had given her, for the household had not connected them to what followed, and no one in authority had been given cause to look. The body was buried in the ordinary way, in a Lambeth burial ground, and the record of Matilda Clover's death was to all appearances complete. She was one more poor woman of the district who had died as poor women of the district died, and the machinery of the law had no reason to concern itself with her. For the better part of a year, that is how the matter stood. There was no investigation because there was, so far as anyone in authority knew, no crime. The file was closed almost as soon as it was opened. The child was left without his mother. The lodging on the Lambeth Road passed to other uses, and the servant girl, Lucy Rose, carried in her memory the image of the tall moustached man in the silk hat without any occasion to give it, for no one asked her, and there seemed no reason that anyone ever should. The death had been explained, and an unexplained death does not invite inquiry. That the case did not remain closed is owing not to the ordinary progress of detection, but to the conduct of the man who had caused the death. He was a man who could not leave the record of his own crimes alone. In the months that followed the death of Matilda Clover, he set about a course of letter writing that would, in the end, be the sole cause of his undoing, for the letters revealed a knowledge that only the poisoner himself could possess. It is a rare thing in the record of criminal cases that the whole reopening of a matter should proceed from the compulsion of the guilty party to write, but that is precisely what occurred here. Before the character and career of that man can be set out, the wider situation into which his letters fell must be described, for the letters would not have had their effect had the ground not already been disturbed by other deaths. In the same district, in the same months, other women had died in the same manner, and by the spring of 1892, the authorities of the Metropolitan Police had begun to understand that something was moving through the poor streets of Lambeth that could not be explained by drink or by chance. It was into this awakening suspicion that the letters concerning Matilda Clover would fall, and it was the collision of the two that would at last give her death its true name. The first of the deaths that would come to be understood as part of a single series had in fact preceded that of Matilda Clover by a week. A young woman named Ellen Donworth, known also as Nellie Donworth, had been taken ill in the street in Lambeth and had died on the 13th of October 1891 in convulsions of the same character as those that would seize Matilda Clover 7 days later. At the time her death, like the death that followed it, had not been understood as murder in the sense that would later be established, though the circumstances of it were sufficiently marked to draw a coroner's attention. She too had been given something to drink or to swallow by a man she had encountered. She too had died in agony. Her death and Matilda Clover's stood unrecognised as the opening of a series. The series did not end with them. In the following spring, on a single night, in April of 1892, 2 more young women died in the same district and in the same manner. Their names were Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivel, and they lodged together, and they died together, or nearly so, having been given pills by a man who'd come to them as a friend and a benefactor. Their deaths, coming as they did upon two others already recorded, could not be dismissed as the ordinary misfortunes of the district. 4 women dead of convulsions in the space of half a year, all of them poor, all of them of the same manner of life, all of them seized in the night after taking something given to them by a man, formed a pattern that the police could no longer overlook. It was the deaths of Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivel that turned the attention of Scotland Yard fully upon the matter, and it was in the course of that attention that the earlier death of Matilda Clover would be recovered from the natural causes file into which it had been consigned. The man responsible for all 4 deaths, and for others besides on the far side of the Atlantic, was a physician. His name was Thomas Neil Cream. He had been born in Glasgow in the year 1850, and while he was still a child his family had emigrated to Canada, where he was raised and where he received his education. He entered upon the study of medicine at McGill University in Montreal, and he qualified there in the year 1876, taking his degree in the ordinary way and entering upon the profession of a physician. He pursued further study afterward in Britain, in Edinburgh and in London, adding to the qualifications he had obtained in Canada. On paper, he was a man of the respectable professional class, a doctor with training on 2 continents, and it was this appearance of respectability that allowed him to move, as he did among the poor of Lambeth, without exciting alarm. Beneath that appearance, however, his career had trailed a succession of deaths from its earliest years. In the practice of medicine in Canada, and afterward in the United States, he was associated with a series of deaths, and with the practice of abortion, and his name gathered about it a reputation that followed him from place to place. The pattern that would culminate in Lambeth had been established long before he ever set foot in South London. He was a man who used his medical knowledge, and in particular his access to and understanding of poisons, not for the preservation of life, but for its destruction, and he had done so on both sides of the Atlantic before the women of Lambeth ever came into his path. The most consequential episode of his earlier career had occurred in the United States, in the state of Illinois. There, in the year 1881, he had been implicated in the death by poisoning of a man named Daniel Stott, and the manner of that death had been strychnine, the same agent he would afterward carry into the streets of Lambeth. He was convicted of that murder and was sentenced to imprisonment, and he was confined in the penitentiary at Joliet in Illinois. It is a fact of the first importance in his history, and one that bears directly upon a legend that would later attach itself to his name, that he was in that prison, serving that sentence during the years in the late 1880s when other and more famous crimes were committed in London. He did not walk free again until the summer and autumn of 1891, when he was released from Joliet after serving a portion of his sentence, and it was directly upon that release that he made his way to England and arrived in London. He reached the capital in October of 1891. Within days of his arrival, the deaths began. Ellen Donworth died on the 13th of that month. Matilda Clover died on the 21st. The speed with which he set about his work upon reaching London indicates that the impulse that governed him had not been extinguished by his years in the Illinois penitentiary, but had, if anything, been sharpened by them. He established himself in lodgings in the district, he moved among its public houses and its streets, and he presented himself to the women he encountered as what he was, a doctor, a man with pills and powders, and the authority to prescribe them. It was an authority that the poor of the district had no reason to distrust, and every reason, in their want of proper medical care, to welcome. His method was consistent across his victims. He administered strychnine, generally in the form of pills or capsules, to women who had no cause to suspect that the man who gave them was anything other than what he appeared. Strychnine is a poison that acts upon the body with terrible force and within a period that may be measured in hours, producing the violent convulsions that had been witnessed at the bedside of Matilda Clover and at the bedsides of the others It was a poison well suited to his purpose, for its effects to those who did not know what they were seeing could be mistaken for the throes of some natural seizure or for the consequences of drink, and it left the poisoner free to depart into the night, long before the illness reached its crisis. He gave the pills, he gave his instructions, and he was gone from the house before the convulsions began. It was in the matter of the letters that his conduct departed from the ordinary caution of the poisoner and became the instrument of his own destruction. Cream was possessed of a compulsion to write, and the letters he wrote were not the letters of a man concealing his crimes, but the letters of a man determined to direct the attention of others toward them, and to do so for purposes of accusation and of extortion. He wrote to persons of standing, and in his letters he accused innocent men of the very poisonings he had himself committed, and he sought, in some instances, to extract money by the threat of exposure. It was a course of conduct so contrary to his own safety that it can only be understood as the expression of a compulsion he could not master. In the case of Matilda Clover, the letter he wrote was the single act that recovered her death from the natural causes file into which it had been buried. He wrote accusing a respected physician, a man wholly innocent, of having poisoned Matilda Clover. The accusation named a crime in writing. And here lay the fatal error, for the death of Matilda Clover had been certified as arising from natural causes, from the effects of drink, and no one in authority believed that any crime had been committed at all. Officially, Matilda Clover had not been murdered. She had died of drink and had been buried, and the file had been closed. For a man to write a letter accusing another of her murder was therefore to assert a knowledge that no innocent person could possess. Only the poisoner himself could know that Matilda Clover had been poisoned, because to every other person in the world she had simply died. It was this impossibility that the authorities of Scotland Yard, by then alert to the strychnine deaths of Ellen Donworth and of Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivel, at last perceived. The letters intended to cast suspicion upon others cast it instead upon their author, for they revealed a mind in possession of facts that the record did not contain. A letter that accused a man of a murder the law did not know had occurred was not evidence against the man accused. It was evidence against the man who had written it. The detectives who examined the correspondence understood that the writer had convicted himself with his own pen, and from that understanding the whole reopening of the case proceeded. The investigation, once it had fixed upon Cream, was formally opened and pursued with the deliberation that the gravity of the matter required. Officers of the Criminal Investigation Department turned their attention to the movements of the physician who had arrived in London in the October of the previous year. Statements were taken from the persons who had encountered him. The lodging houses he had frequented were identified. The public houses of the district where he had been seen in the company of the women who had died yielded witnesses who could speak to his presence and to his manner. Piece by piece the officers assembled a record of a man who had moved through the poorest streets of Lambeth in the months of the deaths, a doctor with money and a silk hat, giving pills to women who had no reason to refuse them. Among the witnesses whose testimony would prove of the greatest value was the servant girl Lucy Rose, who had been present in the house on the Lambeth Road on the last night of Matilda Clover's life. She had seen the caller. She had observed him with the attentiveness of a servant whose place it was to know who came and went, and she was able to furnish the officers with the description she had carried, unasked, through all the months since. A tall man, a heavy moustache, a silk top hat, a man of means, out of place in the house he had entered. When at length she was shown the man the police had taken, or was asked to speak to what she had seen, her account answered to him, and her recollection of that evening became one of the pillars upon which the case for the prosecution would rest. The officers were careful, as the investigation proceeded, to place Cream in the district at the material times, and to establish the pattern that connected the several deaths. It was not enough to suspect. It was necessary to demonstrate, by the accumulation of testimony and of circumstance, that the man they had identified had been present, had been in possession of the means, and had administered them. To that end, the movements of the four women in their last hours were traced so far as the record and the memory of witnesses allowed, and in each the figure of a man answering to the same description was found. The consistency of that figure across the several deaths was itself a fact of evidential weight, for it was not credible that four women, unknown to one another, should each in her last hours have encountered, by chance, a different tall and moustached gentleman bearing pills. The detectives placed the suspect under observation before they moved to take him. He was watched in his movements about the city, and the pattern of his conduct was noted, and when the case against him had been sufficiently assembled, he was arrested and charged. The man who had been released from the penitentiary at Joliet in the summer of 1891, and who had come to London in the October of that year, was now himself in the hands of the law, and the deaths that had passed one after another, as the misfortunes of the poor, were gathered together and laid at his door. Before the matter could proceed to trial, however, it was necessary to establish, by the only means that could establish it, that Matilda Clover had in fact died of poison and not of the drink to which her death had been attributed. The certification of natural causes stood upon the record. To overturn it required that the body be recovered and examined, and to that end an order was obtained for the exhumation of the remains. In the spring of 1892, Matilda Clover was taken up from the Lambeth burial ground in which she had lain since the previous October, and her body was subjected to the examination that had never been thought necessary at the time of her death. The examination was conducted by medical men versed in the detection of poison, and its object was to determine whether strychnine was present in the remains. The examination established that it was. Strychnine was recovered from the body, and its presence established, beyond the reach of the earlier certification, that Matilda Clover had died not of the effects of drink, but of the effects of poison administered to her. The convulsions that the household had witnessed on the night of her death, the sudden and violent seizures that had been mistaken for the throes of a natural illness, were the recognised signs of strychnine poisoning, and the toxicological findings confirmed what those signs, rightly read, had indicated all along. A death that had been dismissed as a drunkard's was shown, by the examination of the exhumed remains, to have been a clinical poisoning. The significance of this finding extended beyond the establishment of the cause of death. It exposed the ease with which the true nature of the death had been overlooked, and the reasons for that oversight. Matilda Clover had been poor. She had been a woman of a certain manner of life. She had been known to drink. Each of these facts had contributed to the readiness with which her death had been explained and closed, and each had served, unwittingly, the purpose of the man who had poisoned her, for he had chosen his victims with an understanding of precisely how their deaths would be received. A poor woman known to drink could be poisoned with strychnine, and her death would be written down as the natural end of a life of drink, and no one would look further. That the death was recovered at all was owing not to the vigilance of the system that had certified it, but to the compulsion of the poisoner to write letters he had no need to write, with the cause of death established by the exhumation and the toxicological examination. The way was open for the case to proceed through the proper channels toward trial. But before the trial could commence, the reversal of the original certification had to be effected in the manner the law required, and that reversal was accomplished through the coroner's inquest, which was the instrument by which a death improperly certified could be brought again under formal inquiry and its true character determined. Because the death of Matilda Clover had been certified as natural at the time it occurred, there had been no contemporaneous inquest into it in the October of 1891. An inquest is convened where the cause of a death is unknown, or violent, or unnatural, and the certification of drink had removed the death from that category and placed it among the ordinary deaths that require no such inquiry. It was only after the exhumation and the recovery of the poison from the remains that the machinery of the inquest was set in motion, and a fresh inquiry was convened into a death that had already been buried and closed once before. The inquest into the death of Matilda Clover was held in the year 1892, before the coroner, and it was an inquiry of an unusual character, for it was convened not to determine the cause of a death that was unexplained, but to correct the record of a death that had already been explained wrongly. The coroner's court gathered the evidence that had been assembled since the exhumation. The findings of the toxicological examination were laid before it, establishing the presence of strychnine in the remains. The witnesses who had seen the caller on the last night of Matilda Clover's life were heard, and among them the servant girl Lucy Rose, whose description of the tall moustached man in the silk hat was set upon the record under oath. The evidence placed before the coroner's jury was of a kind that admitted of only one conclusion. A woman certified to have died of drink had been shown, upon examination of her exhumed remains, to have died of poison. A man answering to a consistent description had been present in her lodging on the night of her death, and had given her pills to be taken before she slept. That same man had afterward written a letter accusing an innocent person of the very poisoning, thereby disclosing a knowledge of the crime that no innocent person could hold. The coroner's jury weighed the evidence brought before it and returned a verdict of wilful murder against Thomas Neal Cream. The verdict of the inquest was of great consequence, for it accomplished in law what the exhumation had accomplished in fact. It reversed the certification of natural causes upon which the death had been closed the previous October, and it declared, by the finding of a coroner's jury, that Matilda Clover had been murdered. Upon that finding, the case was committed toward trial, and the man against whom the verdict had been returned was held to answer for the murder at the Central Criminal Court. A death that had been dismissed without inquiry was now the subject of the gravest inquiry the law could mount. The reflective weight of the inquest lay in the reversal it recorded. A death entered upon the register as the natural end of a woman who drank had been taken up again, examined, and found to be a murder. The coroner's court had corrected a record that would otherwise have stood uncorrected forever, and it had named the man responsible. The proceeding demonstrated the value of the inquest as an instrument of inquiry, and it demonstrated equally how nearly the inquiry had never been held at all, for it had been set in motion not by the diligence of the authorities but by the letters of the murderer himself. The trial commenced at the Central Criminal Court, the court known as the Old Bailey, in London in the October of 1892, 1 year after the death of Matilda Clover. Thomas Neal Cream stood indicted for her murder. It was upon the single count of the murder of Matilda Clover that he was tried, though the deaths of the other women formed part of the body of evidence brought against him, for the prosecution was permitted to place before the jury the pattern of poisonings of which her death was a part. He was arraigned upon the indictment, and to the charge of the wilful murder of Matilda Clover he pleaded not guilty, and the trial proceeded before the judge and jury of the Central Criminal Court. The case for the prosecution was built upon several pillars, each of which had been established in the course of the investigation and the inquest. The first was the evidence of the household of the Lambeth Road, and above all the evidence of the servant girl Lucy Rose, who described the caller of the 20th of October and connected him, by his appearance and his conduct, to the man in the dock. The description she gave of a tall man heavily moustached and wearing a silk top hat, a man of evident means, out of place in the house he had entered, was set before the jury as the account of an eyewitness to the last hours of the victim's life. The second pillar was the medical and toxicological evidence arising from the exhumation. The medical men who had conducted the examination of the exhumed remains testified to the recovery of strychnine from the body, and to the conclusion that the death had been caused by that poison, and not by the drink to which it had first been attributed. The convulsive symptoms witnessed at the bedside were identified as the characteristic signs of strychnine poisoning, and the jury was thus furnished with proof, in the language of the medical witnesses, that Matilda Clover had died by poison administered to her. The third and most damning pillar was the evidence of Cream's own letters. The prosecution laid before the jury the correspondence in which the prisoner had accused an innocent physician of the murder of Matilda Clover, and it drew for the jury the conclusion that the correspondence compelled. At the time the letter was written, the death of Matilda Clover stood upon the record as a natural death. No crime was known to have occurred. For the prisoner to have written, accusing another of her murder, was to have disclosed a knowledge of the poisoning that could belong only to the poisoner. The letters, offered by their author as accusations against others, were received by the court as proof of the guilty knowledge of the man who had written them. To these pillars, the prosecution added the pattern of the wider series. The deaths of Ellen Donworth, of Alice Marsh, and of Emma Shrivel were placed before the jury, not as counts upon which the prisoner then stood to be convicted, but as evidence of a system, a consistent method by which women of the district had been poisoned by strychnine, given to them in pills by a man of the same description. The consistency of the method across the several deaths tended to exclude the possibility of chance or of innocent coincidence, and to establish that the deaths were the work of a single hand, and that the hand was the prisoner's. The prisoner was defended, and the case for the defence sought to test the identification and to question the sufficiency of the evidence connecting the prisoner to the particular death charged. But the weight of the prosecution's case lay in the convergence of its several parts, and above all, in the letters, which no ingenuity of the defence could explain away, for they proceeded from the prisoner's own hand and disclosed a knowledge that innocence could not account for. The eyewitness description, the toxicological proof, the pattern of the series, and the self-incriminating correspondence formed together a body of evidence of great strength. The trial was conducted over the course of its several days, with the deliberation that a capital charge required. The witnesses were examined and cross-examined. The medical evidence was tested. The letters were read into the record, and their significance argued before the jury. The judge, in the customary manner, directed the jury upon the law and reviewed for them the evidence that had been given. When the case on both sides was closed and the direction concluded, the jury retired to consider its verdict upon the single grave question that had been placed before it, whether the prisoner was guilty of the wilful murder of Matilda Clover. The jury did not remain long in its deliberation. When it returned to the court, it delivered its verdict. The prisoner, Thomas Neil Cream, was found guilty of the murder of Matilda Clover. The verdict answered every pillar of the prosecution's case. It accepted the identification of the caller, the toxicological proof of poisoning, the significance of the self-incriminating letters, and the pattern of the wider series, and it found, upon the whole of that evidence, that the man in the dock had poisoned the woman whose death had once been written down as the natural end of a life of drink. Upon the return of the verdict, the court proceeded to sentence. The charge upon which the prisoner had been convicted was murder, and the sentence prescribed by the law of the time for that crime was death. The judge passed the sentence of death upon Thomas Neil Cream in the accustomed form. The man who'd come to London in the October of 1891 and had, within days of his arrival, begun the series of poisonings of which the murder of Matilda Clover was a part, now stood condemned to die for one of those poisonings upon the evidence he had himself, through his letters, supplied. The case had, by the time of its conclusion, commanded the attention of the nation. The proceedings at the Central Criminal Court were reported at length in the press, and the figure of the poisoner who had moved unremarked among the poor women of Lambeth, a doctor with money and a silk hat administering death in the form of pills, answered to the anxieties of the age concerning the anonymous predator who could pass through the crowded districts of the capital without drawing notice. The transformation of Matilda Clover from a woman whose death had been dismissed as drink into the victim, upon whose case a serial poisoner had been convicted, was the pivot upon which the whole matter turned. And it was that transformation that the nation followed in the columns of its newspapers. Following the sentence of death, the matter passed from the court to the officers charged with the carrying out of the capital sentence, and the interval between the sentence and its execution was occupied in the ordinary way, with the disposal of any appeal for clemency and with the preparations that the law required. No circumstance arose to disturb the verdict or to stay the sentence. The guilt of the condemned man had been established upon evidence of great strength, and the case for mercy, such as it was, found no purchase against the weight of the poisonings he had carried out. The condemned man was held to await the day appointed for his execution. The execution of Thomas Neal Cream was carried out at Newgate on the 15th of November, 1892. The sentence of the court was performed in the accustomed manner within the walls of the prison, and the office of executioner was discharged by James Billington, who held that office in the period. With the carrying out of the sentence, the man who had poisoned Matilda Clover and the other women of Lambeth was removed from the record of the living, and the case that had begun with a death dismissed as drink concluded with the lawful death of the man responsible for it. There attaches to the scaffold at Newgate a legend that has followed the name of Thomas Neal Cream through the years since his execution, and it is a legend that must be set out plainly and plainly corrected, for it has been repeated so often that it has acquired in some accounts the appearance of fact. It is said that as the drop fell, the condemned man began to speak, and that the words he began were the words, "I am Jack there." It is said, upon the strength of this reported fragment, that Cream sought, in his final moment, to claim himself the author of the murders committed in Whitechapel in the year 1888. The claim and the legend built upon it do not withstand examination. The reason the legend cannot stand is a matter of plain record. In the year 1888, when the Whitechapel murders were committed, Thomas Neal Cream was not in London. He was not in England. He was confined in the penitentiary at Joliet in the state of Illinois, serving the sentence imposed upon him for the poisoning of Daniel Stott, and he did not walk free from that confinement until the summer and autumn of 1891. A man imprisoned in Illinois cannot have committed murders in London 3 years before his release, and the reported scaffold declaration, whatever was or was not said in that moment, cannot be true in the meaning that has been attached to it. The claim is legend, and it is a legend contradicted by the documented fact of his imprisonment. The murder of Matilda Clover, and the wider series of poisonings of which it formed a part, entered the record of Victorian crime as a landmark case, and it did so for reasons that reach beyond the notoriety of the man who committed it. It stood as an example, studied afterward, of the ease with which a poisoning could pass among the poor as a natural death, and of the conditions that permitted it to do so. It stood equally as an example of the part played by the criminal's own conduct in his undoing, for the case had been broken not by detection in the ordinary sense, but by the compulsion of the poisoner to write letters that disclosed what no innocent person could know. The case has persisted in the literature of Victorian crime in the years since. The figure of the Lambeth poisoner has been the subject of study by writers concerned with the history of poisoning and with the criminal history of the period, and the case has been examined at length in scholarly and popular accounts alike, among them the study by Angus MacLaren under the title A Prescription for Murder. The persistent and false association with the Whitechapel murders has drawn the case too into the literature of that other and greater mystery, where the name of Cream appears among the many that have been proposed, and upon examination set aside. Matilda Clover herself is remembered chiefly through this literature and through the local history of the South London district in which she lived and died. The wider significance of the case lay in what it revealed of the conditions of late Victorian Lambeth and of the vulnerabilities of the women who lived there. It revealed how a poor woman's death could be certified and closed without inquiry, upon an explanation that suited the assumptions made about her manner of life. It revealed how a man of the professional class, a doctor with money and the outward marks of respectability, could move through the poorest streets of the capital and administer death without exciting the alarm that a stranger of meaner appearance might have provoked. And it revealed the reliance of the authorities in a case of this kind upon the self-incrimination of the criminal rather than upon the detection of the crime. For without the letters, the death of Matilda Clover would in all likelihood have remained forever what it had first been recorded as, the natural end of a woman who drank. The district in which she died was, in the years of the poisonings, one of the most crowded and hardest pressed in the whole of the metropolis, a place where the certification of death was casual and where the deaths of the poor did not command the scrutiny that the deaths of the propertied commanded. The women, among whom Cream moved, lived at the margin of the district's economy, without the protections that station and property afforded, and it was precisely their want of those protections that had recommended them to him as victims. He had understood that their deaths would be received without suspicion, and in the case of Matilda Clover, he had understood correctly, for her death was received and certified and closed exactly as he had calculated it would be. The case thus took its place in the history of Victorian forensic inquiry as an instance both of failure and of correction. The failure lay in the original certification, which had accepted the appearance of a natural death and had looked no further. The correction lay in the exhumation and the toxicological examination, which had recovered from the buried remains, the proof of poisoning that no one had thought to seek at the time of the death. That the correction was possible at all depended upon the preservation of the evidence in the body and upon the willingness of the authorities, once their suspicion had been roused, to take up a death that had already been closed and to subject it to the inquiry it had never received. What the record preserves of Matilda Clover in the end is bound up inseparably with the record of the man who killed her. She left little behind her of her own. The years of her life before Lambeth Road are, for the most part, unrecorded. The son she had raised alone passed out of the account, a child left without his mother, by a crime that was not understood to be a crime until he was older still. Her name survives because her death, alone among the deaths of the series, became the count upon which the poisoner was tried and convicted, and because the letters that named her murder were the thread by which the whole case was drawn back into the light. The story of the case, told in its proper order, is the story of a death twice examined, once carelessly and once with care, and of the great distance between the two examinations. On the first occasion, the death of Matilda Clover was read as the ordinary end of a poor woman's disordered life, and it was written down and put away. On the second occasion, a year later, and only after the intervention of the murderer's own pen, the same death was read as what it was, a poisoning carried out by a physician who had made a study of administering death and passing it off as nature. The two readings stand together in the record, the false and the true, and between them lies the whole of the case. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1892. The case became part of the national record. It has not left. That is where the record of the second case ends. We turn now to the last of these three accounts, quieter still than the two before it, and carried on from a different decade and a different corner of Britain entirely. It is a case set not in the crowded streets of the capital, but among the tenant farms and ploughed fields of rural Scotland, where a small community knew one another well, and where the same question that no proceeding in London could finally settle would be asked again, and answered no more completely. The case of Janet Rogers begins in Hertfordshire, Scotland, in the spring of 1866. Mount Stuart Farm lay near the village of Forgandenny, in the low, fertile country south of the River Erne, a district of tenant farms worked by hired men and their families in the settled rhythm of the Scottish agricultural year. Hertfordshire, in the middle of the 19th century, was a county of small market towns and scattered farmsteads, its population drawn largely from the land and the trades that served it. The city of Perth, some miles to the northeast, was the county town and the centre of its commerce, and it was to the weekly market there that the farmers of the surrounding parishes travelled to buy and sell. The land around Forgandenny was arable and mixed, worked in fields that in late March would have lain wet and heavy under the ploughs, the sowing not yet finished and the days still short. A tenant farmer of the district held his ground from a landed proprietor and worked it with the labour of hired servants, the ploughmen and farm workers, who were engaged at the feeing markets and who lived close to their employers, often within the same steading or in cottages a short walk from the farmhouse. The farmhouse itself was the centre of the holding, and its kitchen was the centre of the farmhouse, the room in which the work of the household was done, and in which the life of the farm turned. It was a settled and closely bound society. In a rural parish of this kind, the households of a district were known to one another, the movements of neighbours were observed, and the hired men of a farm were familiar figures who came and went by the day. Strangers were noticed. The distances were walked or ridden, and the pattern of a working week, market day, the hours of labour in the fields, the return home at dusk, was regular and understood by all. Into this settled world, in the last week of March 1866, Janet Rogers had recently come, and she had been at Mount Stuart barely a week when she was killed. Janet Rogers had been born Janet Henderson, a countrywoman of Hertfordshire, and at the time of her death she was 55 years of age. She was married to James Rogers, a labourer, and she was the mother of 5 grown daughters, all of them by then women of their own households. The surviving record of her earlier life is limited, as is usual for a working woman of the rural labouring and small farming class in that period, whose lives were seldom set down in detail while they were lived. What the record establishes is that she was a settled and respectable member of her farming community, a capable woman of the kind whose steadiness was relied upon by those who knew her. Her brother was William Henderson, the tenant farmer of Mount Stuart Farm, and it was through him that she came to be at the farmhouse in the spring of 1866. Henderson had recently been widowed, and he was without a woman to keep his house, while he sought a permanent servant to fill the place. In such circumstances, it was natural that he should call upon his sister, a married countrywoman of long standing and known ability, to come and keep house for him in the interval. She travelled to Mount Stuart to do so, leaving her own home to take up the domestic work of her brother's farmhouse, for as long as it should be needed. She had been at the farm only a short time. The arrangement was recent and understood to be temporary, a matter of weeks at most, until a permanent servant could be engaged. In that brief period she took up the ordinary work of the household, the cooking and the cleaning and the keeping of the kitchen, in a house and a steading that were still comparatively new to her. She was known to her brother's neighbours as his sister come to keep house, a respectable woman of middle age lately arrived in the district. Her presence at Mount Stuart was, in the ordinary course of things, entirely unremarkable. The record of who she had been before that spring is thin, and the Channel's practice is to say so plainly rather than to furnish what the documents do not hold. What can be established is her station and her circumstances: a labourer's wife, a mother of 5, a countrywoman of Hertfordshire in her 56th year, respectable and relied upon, and lately come to her widowed brother's farm to keep his house. The remainder of her life, its earlier decades, its ordinary joys and troubles, was not set down and cannot now be recovered with any certainty. What the record holds in detail is not the life but its ending, and the long attempt to account for it. In the last week of March 1866, then, Janet Rogers was established at Mount Stewart Farm, near Forgandony, keeping house for her brother William Henderson while he looked for a servant. The farm went on with its work, the fields were being prepared for the season, and the household kept its ordinary hours. There was nothing in the arrangement, and nothing in the week that followed her arrival, to mark it out from any other quiet interval in the working life of a Perthshire farm. That ordinariness is itself part of the record, for it was against so plain a background that the events of the 30th of March took place. The 30th of March 1866 was a market day at Perth. In the settled pattern of the farming week, market day drew the farmers of the surrounding parishes into the county town to buy and to sell, and William Henderson, the tenant of Mount Stewart, went into Perth market that day as the ordinary business of his holding required. His departure left the farmhouse to his sister. Janet Rogers remained at Mount Stewart, keeping the house as she had done since her arrival while her brother was away in the town. The farm servants were about the ground and the fields in the ordinary course of the day's work. Among the men employed on the holding was a ploughman named James Crichton, who worked at Mount Stewart in that capacity. The movements of the household and of the hired men through the hours of that afternoon would later become the substance of a long inquiry, examined and re-examined in the sworn statements taken by the Scottish authorities. On the day itself, however, the 30th of March passed as a market day passed, with the master away in Perth and the work of the farm going forward under the low light of a late March afternoon. It was on William Henderson's return from Perth that the ordinary day ended. Coming back to his farmhouse in the later part of the day, he found the kitchen door locked. The kitchen was the room in which his sister would have been at her work, and its door was fastened against him. A locked door on a working farm, in the middle of the day's business, with the household understood to be within, was not the ordinary state of things, and it was this that first marked the afternoon as wrong. On gaining entry to the house, Henderson found his sister dead. Janet Rogers had been killed in the farmhouse kitchen by blows to the head, struck with a heavy implement, and death had followed from the injuries she had received. The medical examination that would later be conducted established the cause of death as the injuries to the head. The account here keeps to that single fact, and does not go beyond it. She had been alive and at her work when her brother left for market that morning. She was dead in the kitchen when he returned. The scene that confronted the household, and, in short order, the authorities, was in one respect deeply strange. Nothing of consequence had been taken from the house. Robbery, when it came to be considered, did not fit what was found, for the goods and valuables of the farmhouse remained as they had been. A killing in the course of theft would have left the marks of theft, and those marks were absent. The one plain motive that might have brought a stranger to the door was not borne out by the state of the house, and its absence was among the earliest and most troubling features of the case. Two details, set together, form the load-bearing strangeness of the scene, and they were remarked upon from the first. The kitchen door had been locked. Nothing of value had been removed. A stranger come to rob would have taken, and would not, in the ordinary case, have paused to lock the door of the room in which he left his victim. The combination pointed away from the passing intruder and towards someone with reason to be at the farm and knowledge of its ways, and it was this that sharpened the suspicion of the authorities toward a person connected with the holding itself. The inquiry that followed would proceed from that starting point. Word of the killing was carried from Mount Stewart to the proper authorities, and the machinery of the Scottish criminal law was set in motion. The investigation that opened upon the death of Janet Rogers would become one of the longest undertaken by a Scottish police force in the 19th century, a prolonged and painstaking effort to account for an afternoon on which there had been no direct witness to the act. In the Scottish system, the responsibility for investigating a suspicious death and preparing any prosecution lay with the procurator fiscal, the public official charged with inquiring into the death and gathering the sworn statements upon which a case would rest. The procurator fiscal for the county took up the inquiry, and officers were dispatched to Mount Stuart to examine the scene and to secure what could be secured of the circumstances. In 1866, in rural Perthshire, the resources available to a criminal investigation were those of a county constabulary of modest size and of the fiscal's office, working without the forensic apparatus that a later age would bring to such a death. There was no science of fingerprints, no examination of blood beyond the plainest observation, no means of tracing a man by anything he might have left behind. What the investigation had to work with was testimony, the sworn accounts of those who'd been at or near the farm, and the physical facts of the house as they had been found. The gathering of those accounts was the work of the precognition, the distinctively Scottish procedure by which the fiscal took sworn pre-trial statements from every person who might have knowledge bearing upon the death. The precognition was not conducted in open court and was not itself evidence at any trial, but it was the foundation upon which the decision to prosecute would be made and the case prepared. Statement by statement, the fiscal built up an account of the afternoon of the 30th of March, of who had been where, of what had been seen and heard, and of the movements of the household and the hired men through the hours in which Janet Rogers had died. From the outset, the direction of the inquiry was governed by the two facts that had marked the scene as strange. Nothing had been stolen, and the door had been locked. Together, they turned the investigation inward, away from the notion of a passing stranger, and toward the people of the farm and the district who had reason and opportunity to be near the house. In a small rural community, where the hired men were known and their comings and goings observed, the field of persons who could have been at the farmhouse in the afternoon was not large, and the fiscal's inquiry moved among them with the patience that the Scottish procedure required. Suspicion, in the course of that inquiry, came to settle upon James Crichton, the ploughman employed on Mount Stuart farm. It must be stated plainly, and it will be stated plainly throughout this account, that suspicion is not proof, and that the grounds against Crichton were from first to last circumstantial. He was a man of the farm, present in the district that day, and the inquiry examined his movements and his statements as it examined those of others. What raised him above the other persons considered was a set of particulars that the fiscal found difficult to reconcile, and it was upon those particulars that the case against him would be built. Among the matters raised against Crichton was a question over washed clothing, the suggestion that garments had been cleaned in circumstances that the investigation found worthy of note. There were questions, too, over his account of his own movements on the afternoon of the 30th of March, over where he had been and when, and whether that account held together against the statements of others. And there were said to be inconsistencies in the statements he himself gave, points at which his successive accounts did not sit easily with one another. These were the threads the fiscal drew together, and they were threads of circumstance, no one of them amounting on its own to direct evidence of the act. There was no witness to the killing, no person had seen the blow struck, and no person came forward to say that they had seen Crichton, or anyone else, enter the kitchen at the hour of the death. The case that the fiscal assembled was a case built entirely upon circumstance, upon opportunity, and upon the difficulties in the accused man's own account, and it was assembled in the knowledge that direct proof was wanting. Upon the strength of what had been gathered, James Crichton was arrested and committed to stand trial for the murder of Janet Rogers. The investigation, in the fuller sense, did not end with his committal, for the fiscal continued to prepare and to test the statements that would carry the case forward, and the length of the whole inquiry was such that it was remembered as among the most protracted a Scottish force had undertaken in that century. Officers returned again to the ground and to the witnesses. The accounts were compared and recompared. The particulars against the accused were refined and set in order for the court. Yet the character of the case did not change with its length. It remained circumstantial to the end, resting upon inference from the surrounding facts rather than upon any single item that placed the weapon in the hand of the man accused. The state of the investigation, taken together, was this. A woman had been killed in a locked kitchen while the master of the farm was at market. Nothing had been taken. No one had seen the act. Suspicion, drawn inward by the absence of theft and the fastened door, had fixed upon a ploughman of the farm on the ground of his washed clothing, his account of his movements, and the inconsistencies in his statements. He had been arrested and committed for trial. The proof against him was circumstantial, and the direct evidence was absent, and it was upon that footing that the case would go before a court. The medical examination of the body was conducted by the doctors who attended upon the death, in accordance with the Scottish practice, by which the cause of a suspicious death was established for the purposes of the fiscal's inquiry. There was, it should be said, no coroner and no coroner's inquest in Scotland, the office and the procedure of the English coroner having no place in the Scottish system. The investigation of the death proceeded instead through the fiscal and the medical men he engaged. The examining physicians addressed themselves to the injuries Janet Rogers had received and to the manner of her death. Their finding as to the cause of death was that she had died of the injuries to her head, inflicted with a heavy implement. Contemporary accounts of the case refer to an axe or a similar heavy tool as the weapon, and the medical evidence would have spoken to the nature of the wounds and to the kind of instrument likely to have caused them. This account keeps to the single clinical fact that the cause of death was the head injuries, and does not itemize the wounds. The medical men established that the injuries were severe and that they had been rapidly fatal, and it was their determination of the cause of death that formed the medical foundation of the case the fiscal would bring. Beyond the cause of death, the medical evidence bore upon the question of the weapon, and through it upon the question of who might have wielded it. If the instrument were an axe or a heavy tool of the farm, it was a thing that lay ready to hand in the ordinary furniture of a working steading, familiar to any man employed there. The medical determination that the blows had been struck with such an implement was therefore of a piece with the direction the whole inquiry had taken inward toward the farm and its people, though it did no more than the rest of the evidence to fix the act upon any single person. A weapon of the farm named no man. The medical findings, so far as they went, established what could be established with the means of the time: that Janet Rogers had died of severe head injuries, inflicted with a heavy implement, and that death had followed quickly upon the blows. They did not and could not identify the hand that had struck them. In 1866, medical evidence could speak to the cause and the manner of a death, but it could not carry an inquiry across the distance from the wound to the person, and in the case of Janet Rogers, that distance was never closed by any evidence, medical or otherwise. With the accused committed and the precognition complete, the case passed from the stage of inquiry to the stage of trial. James Crichton, ploughman, was to be tried for the murder of Janet Rogers at the autumn sitting of the Circuit Court at Perth, the High Court of Justiciary sitting on circuit in the county town, in September of 1866. The record supports the autumn 1866 circuit as the occasion of the trial, though a stray later summary has placed it a year on. The proceedings belong to September 1866. Crichton was brought before the court to answer the charge of murder, to which he pleaded not guilty. The Circuit Court at Perth was the venue at which the graver crimes of the district were tried. The judges of the High Court of Justiciary travelling on circuit to hold the sittings in the principal towns. A charge of murder was among the most serious that could come before it, and the trial of a farm servant for the killing of his master's sister in a locked farmhouse drew the close attention of the Scottish press and of the county. The court was constituted in the Scottish form, with a presiding judge upon the bench and a jury of 15 impanelled to try the facts. That number, 15, being the size of the Scottish criminal jury, distinct from the jury of 12 of the English courts. The prosecution conducted on behalf of the Crown laid before the jury the circumstantial case that the fiscal had assembled. Its elements were those that the inquiry had produced: the question of the washed clothing, the account Crichton had given of his movements on the afternoon of the 30th of March, and the difficulties in it, the inconsistencies said to appear in his statements, and the plain fact of his opportunity as a man of the farm, present in the district on the day, with the implements of the steading ready to hand. From these the Crown invited the jury to conclude that it was Crichton, and no stranger, who had killed Janet Rogers in the kitchen while her brother was at Perth Market. The prosecution having laid its case, the defence answered it upon the ground that the case afforded, which was the ground of its own insufficiency. The defence did not need to prove who had killed Janet Rogers. It needed only to hold the Crown to its burden and to press upon the jury the single governing feature of the proceedings, that the whole of the case was circumstantial, and that not one item of direct evidence tied James Crichton to the act. No witness had seen him strike. No witness had placed him in the kitchen. The washed clothing, the disputed movements, the inconsistencies of statement, these were matters of suspicion, and suspicion, the defence urged, was not the measure the law required before a man might be convicted of murder and sent to the gallows. Each element the Crown advanced was, upon the defence's argument, capable of an innocent construction, or was too slight to bear the weight the prosecution placed upon it. Clothing might be washed for reasons that had nothing to do with a killing. An account of a man's movements over an afternoon of farm labour might be uncertain or mistaken, without being false, memory being an imperfect thing, and the hours of ordinary work unmarked by any reason to fix them. Inconsistencies in successive statements might arise from confusion, from fear, from the ordinary frailty of a man questioned closely about a day he had no cause to remember with precision. None of it, the defence maintained, amounted to proof. The trial was not a lengthy one by the measure of later ages, and the evidence, being circumstantial, turned upon inference rather than upon any dramatic disclosure from the witness box. The witnesses spoke to the surrounding facts, to the state of the house, to the washed clothing, to what was known of Crichton's movements and of the household's arrangements on the day. The medical evidence spoke to the cause of death. Through it all ran the single difficulty that no evidence closed the distance between the established facts and the hand that had struck the blows. When the evidence was concluded and the addresses made, the presiding judge charged the jury upon the law, and the whole passed into their hands. The jury of 15 retired to consider its verdict. In the Scottish criminal procedure, that jury had before it not 2 verdicts but 3. It might find the charge proven and convict. It might find the accused not guilty and acquit him outright. Or it might return the 3rd and distinctively Scottish verdict, not proven, a finding that the Crown had failed to establish guilt to the required standard, but that fell short of a positive declaration of innocence. The not proven verdict acquitted the accused as fully as the verdict of not guilty, so far as his liberty was concerned, for it freed him and barred his further trial upon the charge. But it did not clear his name, and in the mouths of the public it carried the sense that the man had escaped rather than been vindicated. The deliberation of the jury was brief. The accounts of the case record that the 15 were absent from the court for only a very short time, a matter of minutes, reported as about 12, before they returned to deliver their finding. Upon so grave a charge, and after the labour of so long an investigation, the shortness of that interval was itself remarked upon. The jury had not required the hours that a divided or a troubled panel might have taken. They had reached their conclusion quickly and returned to announce it, and the court and the county waited to hear which of the 3 verdicts they had chosen. The verdict of the jury was not proven. James Crichton was neither convicted of the murder of Janet Rogers, nor declared innocent of it. He was found in the manner peculiar to the law of Scotland to stand in the middle ground, the 3rd verdict marked out, the man against whom the case had not been made, but from whom the shadow of the charge was not lifted. Upon the return of that verdict, he was discharged from the bar, a free man. There was no sentence, for there was no conviction. The proceedings that had begun with a locked kitchen door in March ended in September, with the accused walking out of the circuit court at Perth, tried and released. No sentence followed, and none could follow, for the not proven verdict disposed of the case without a finding of guilt. James Crichton left the court under no penalty of the law. He had been arrested, committed, and tried for murder, and he emerged from the trial neither punished nor cleared, returned to a liberty that carried with it the permanent qualification of the verdict that had freed him. There was no imprisonment, no penal servitude, no scaffold. In the ledger of the criminal law, the case against him was closed, and closed in a way that pronounced nothing. For the family of Janet Rogers, and for the community of Forgandony and the wider county, the verdict resolved nothing that the killing had left unresolved. A woman of 55 had been struck down in her brother's kitchen, and after the labour of one of the longest inquiries, a Scottish force had mounted, and after a trial at the circuit court, the law had produced no answer to the question of who had killed her. A man had been accused and freed. No other person was charged. The murder stood upon the record as a thing done by a hand the law would not name, and the not proven verdict, freeing the one man ever brought to trial, foreclosed the prospect that the law would ever name it. The verdict left James Crichton in a position without remedy on either side. He could not be tried again for the killing, the verdict having barred a second prosecution, and so he was beyond the further reach of the law. Yet he was not acquitted in the full sense, and the not proven finding travelled with him as a public fact, a matter known in the district and recorded in the press. He was free to go and unable to be cleared, and the record of his subsequent life is limited and will not be embellished here beyond what it holds. He walked out of Perth into that qualified freedom, and the fuller course of his later years is not established with the certainty that would permit its telling. The case drew heavy attention in the Scottish newspapers, both in its investigation and at its trial, and the not proven verdict became the enduring feature by which it was remembered. In the parish of Forgandony and across Perthshire, it lingered as an open matter, a killing done among a settled community and never brought home to anyone, a wound in the memory of the district that the passage of the ordinary years did not close. The farm went on, the fields were ploughed and sown in their seasons, but the question of the 30th of March 1866 remained where the jury had left it, unanswered and unanswerable, through the ordinary processes of the law. The place of the case in the wider record is bound up with the very verdict that closed it. The not proven finding is a peculiarity of the Scottish criminal law, a third path between conviction and acquittal, and the killing of Janet Rogers came to be cited as one of its notable instances, a case in which the third verdict left a murder formally unresolved and a named man neither condemned nor delivered. It is remembered too for the sheer length of the inquiry that preceded it, and as one of the older murders of its kind in Britain to have passed into the class of the permanently unsolved. The records that survive of it are the records of the Scottish system that tried it, the precognitions and trial papers of the High Court on circuit, and the reports of the Scottish press. In the country around Forgandony, the memory of the case persisted in the way that such a thing persists in a rural district, as a story attached to a farm and a family, handed down and returned to, and eventually re-examined in a fuller and more careful form. The definitive modern treatment of the case was undertaken by a member of the family descended from those it touched, who went back to the whole surviving record, the precognitions, the trial papers, the press accounts, and set the case out afresh, weighing what the documents would and would not support. That re-examination reached the conclusion that the case remains genuinely unsolved, that no proven answer exists, and that no suspect, Crichton or any other, can be shown upon the record to have been the killer. That later re-examination did not and could not, supply the answer the law had failed to reach. It could gather the documents, set the sequence straight, correct the errors that had crept into the looser summaries, and establish with care what was known and what was not. But the distance that the investigation of 1866 had never crossed, the distance between the wounds in the farmhouse kitchen and the hand that had inflicted them, remained uncrossed. The modern account confirmed the limits of the old one. There was suspicion, and there had always been suspicion, but suspicion was not proof, and proof had never come. The case is sometimes noticed as well in the broader Scottish true crime and genealogical writing, and in the local press retrospectives that return to the older mysteries of the county. And through such notices, the name of Janet Rogers has been kept, in a modest way, before those who take an interest in these things. It is not a nationally famous case. It is a regionally remembered one, known in Perthshire and among those who study the Scottish courts and the not proven verdict, and it has been kept alive chiefly by the care of those unwilling to let the killing of a countrywoman pass entirely out of memory unaccounted for. The legal peculiarity by which the case was closed has its own long history in the law of Scotland, and the killing of Janet Rogers sits within that history as one of its recorded instances. The not proven verdict arose in Scottish practice from the older habit by which juries returned findings upon particular facts, rather than a general verdict upon guilt, and over time it settled into the form the trial at Perth employed, a third verdict standing beside guilty and not guilty. In its practical effect it acquits, for the man who receives it goes free and cannot be tried again. In its meaning to the public, it withholds the full acquittal that not guilty confers. It says, in substance, that the case has not been made, and it leaves unspoken the question of whether the man is innocent or has merely escaped. It is this quality of the verdict, freeing without clearing, that fastened it to the memory of the case, and that has caused the killing at Mount Stuart to be recalled whenever the third verdict is discussed. A conviction would have closed the matter with a name and a sentence. A plain acquittal would have closed it, at least in law, with the declaration that the man tried was not the man sought. The not proven verdict did neither. It returned James Crichton to the world, with the charge neither proved against him nor lifted from him, and it returned the killing of Janet Rogers to the archive with no person answerable for it, and it did both in the same breath, in the space of the few minutes the jury had required. The world in which the killing took place, and to which the verdict returned it, was the settled agricultural society of mid-Victorian Perthshire, and something of that world bears upon the case, for it shaped both the manner of the killing and the manner of its investigation. The tenant farms of the district were worked by hired labour engaged at the feeing markets, the gatherings at which farm servants and their masters met to make their bargains for a term of service. A ploughman engaged in this way took his place within the close life of the farm, working its ground through the term of his fee and living at hand to it, familiar with its buildings and its implements and its household. He was not a stranger who came and went, but a known member of the working establishment of the holding. That closeness is the fact that made the case what it was. In a society of strangers, a killing in which nothing was stolen and the door was locked might have pointed 100 ways. In the society of the farm, where the persons with reason and opportunity to be near the house were few and known, it pointed inward, toward the establishment itself, and it was this that made the suspicion of an insider so grave a thing and so socially charged. To suspect a ploughman of the farm was to suspect a man who had eaten within reach of the household and worked its fields, and to try him was to set the ordinary trust of that close society against the circumstances of a single afternoon. The rhythms of that society governed the day of the killing as they governed every other. The 30th of March fell in the season, when the ground was being worked for the spring sowing, the fields wet and heavy after the winter, the daylight lengthening, but the days still short by the measure of the summer to come. Market day drew the farmer to Perth as it drew his neighbours, and the town on such a day filled with the business of the county, the buying and selling of stock and grain, and the settling of the affairs of the farms. It was into the ordinary emptiness that market day left behind, the master gone to town and the household reduced to those who remained, that the events at Mount Stuart fell. The investigation of the death proceeded, in its every step, through the forms of the Scottish system, which differed at each stage from the English procedure by which such a killing would have been examined south of the border. There was no coroner and no inquest impanelled before him. There was instead the procurator fiscal, the local officer of the Crown, charged with inquiring into sudden and suspicious deaths, and the precognition, the taking of sworn statements out of court by which the fiscal gathered and tested the evidence before deciding whether to prosecute. The case, when it went to trial, went not to an assize, but to the Circuit Court of the High Court of Justiciary, and it was tried before a jury not of 12, but of 15, with the 3 verdicts open to them. At every point the machinery was Scottish, and the shape of the case followed the shape of that machinery. The absence of the forensic means of a later age pressed upon the inquiry at every turn. The investigators of 1866 could examine a scene, gather statements and reason from the surrounding facts, and this they did with a thoroughness that made the inquiry one of the longest of its kind in the century. What they could not do was establish, by any physical proof, the connection between a particular person and the act. They could not raise a fingerprint from the door that had been locked. They could not distinguish one man's blood from another's, nor trace a weapon to a hand by anything it carried. They could observe that clothing had been washed. They could not prove what the washing had removed. The inquiry was thorough within the limits of its age, and the limits of its age were the reason the answer never came. Those limits are part of why the case has endured in the reckoning of Scottish criminal history, for it stands as an instance of a killing that the methods of its time could investigate exhaustively and yet never solve. The length of the inquiry and the poverty of the proof are 2 sides of a single fact. The investigators returned again and again to the ground and the witnesses precisely because no single piece of evidence ever settled the matter, and the case went on because it could not be brought to a conclusion. When at last it reached the court, the jury disposed of it in minutes, and the disproportion between the years of inquiry and the brevity of the verdict is itself among the things by which the case is remembered. The killing at Mount Stuart has accordingly held a modest but persistent place among the older unsolved murders of Britain, cited for its antiquity as an unresolved case for the peculiarity of the verdict that closed it, and for the length of the inquiry that preceded it. It is remembered in Perthshire as a local mystery attached to a named farm and a named family, and in the wider Scottish record as a specimen of the not proven verdict at work. The papers of the High Court on Circuit preserve the formal record of it, and the Scottish press of 1866 preserves the contemporary account, and the modern re-examination has consolidated both into a single considered study. Through these the case survives, neither famous nor forgotten, held at the level of the county and of those who study the courts. What the record finally holds is a set of established facts, and a question those facts do not answer. It holds that Janet Rogers, née Henderson, a labourer's wife and the mother of 5 grown daughters, came in the last week of March 1866 to keep house for her widowed brother at Mount Stuart Farm near Forgandenny, and that she had been there about a week. It holds that on the 30th of March, a market day, her brother went to Perth and returned to find the kitchen door locked and his sister dead within, killed by blows to the head, with nothing of value taken. It holds that suspicion fell upon the ploughman James Crichton, that he was arrested and tried at the Circuit Court at Perth in September of that year, and that the jury of 15 returned, after a deliberation of minutes, the verdict of not proven, upon which he was freed, and it holds that no other person was ever charged, and that the killing was never brought home to anyone. Between those established facts lies the space the law never filled. The record can say who the victim was, and where and when and by what manner she died, and what was done to discover her killer, and how the one man ever tried was neither convicted nor cleared. It cannot say whose hand struck the blows in the kitchen of Mount Stuart, while the master was at Perth Market. That is the thing the precognitions did not settle, and the trial did not settle, and the years since have not settled. The documents preserve the shape of the killing with precision and leave its author unnamed, and the more carefully they are read, the more plainly they show where their evidence ends and the unanswered question begins. The care that has kept the case in memory is, in the end, the care of those unwilling to let the killing pass out of the record unaccounted for, the local writers who returned to it, the descendant who re-examined it, the archives that preserved the papers, the newspapers that reported it at the time, and again in later retrospect. Through that care, the name of Janet Rogers has been held against the silence that closes over most such lives, and the fact of her killing has been kept in view, not as a solved thing, but as an open one, a question the documents state, and cannot answer, carried forward by those who declined to let it fall away. The papers that carry the case forward are the ordinary instruments of the Scottish court, and something of their character bears telling, for it is through their particular forms that everything now known of the killing has come down. The precognition, taken by the fiscal, set out the sworn account of each person examined, statement following statement, so that the afternoon of the 30th of March survives not as a single narrative, but as a sheaf of separate testimonies, each speaking to what one person knew. The trial papers of the High Court on circuit preserve the charge, the plea, the course of the proceedings, and the verdict returned. Together, these documents fix the case in the form the law gave it, and it is upon them, rather than upon memory or tradition, that any faithful account must rest. The reports of the Scottish press supply what the court papers do not: the contemporary sense of the case, as it was followed at the time, the attention it drew, the weight the county placed upon it. A killing of this kind in a settled farming parish, tried at the circuit court of the county town, was a matter of general interest, and the newspapers carried the progress of the inquiry and the trial to a readership across Perthshire and beyond. Their columns preserved the fact of the public attention, the reported brevity of the jury's absence, the return of the not proven verdict, and the discharge of the accused. Read now. They show a case that was closely watched in its own day, and that was understood, even then, to have ended without the resolution that so grave a killing demanded. The country in which Mount Stuart lay gives the case its physical setting, and the setting is part of what the record preserves. For Gandenny is a small parish in the low ground, south of the River Erne, which runs westward through the Strath before joining the Tay near Perth, and the farms of the district lie between the river's meadows and the rising ground of the Ochil Hills to the south. It was and remained a landscape of arable fields and pasture, of scattered steadings and cottages, of the roads and tracks that carried the traffic of the farms to the market at Perth. Mount Stuart was one holding among many in this country, a working farm with its farmhouse and its offices, set in its own fields, at a remove from close neighbours in the manner of the district. The farmhouse kitchen in which the killing was done was in a holding of that kind, the working heart of the household, the room in which the food was prepared and the domestic labour carried on, and the room in which a woman keeping house for her brother would have passed the greater part of her working day. That it should have been the scene of the killing was in that sense unremarkable, for it was where Janet Rogers would ordinarily have been found at her work, while the men were in the fields and the master at market. The locked door of that room, on the master's return, was the first sign that the ordinary order of the house had been broken, and it was from that broken order that the whole of what followed proceeded. The absence of theft standing beside the locked door retained through the whole inquiry the quality that had marked it from the first, the quality of a fact that pointed away from the obvious motive and toward a harder question. A house entered for gain would have shown the marks of gain taken. Mount Stuart showed none. The goods of the household remained, and whatever had brought a hand to the kitchen that afternoon, it had not been the plain purpose of robbery that most readily accounts for a killing in a lonely house. The investigators were left to reason from a scene that withheld the ordinary explanation, and the reasoning led them, as it could only lead them, toward the narrow circle of those who had reason to be at the farm. That the circle was narrow did not make the answer certain, and this is the difficulty upon which the whole case finally turned. A narrow field of persons who might have done a thing is not the same as proof that one of them did it. The investigation could reduce the possibilities, could set aside the passing stranger, and fix its attention upon the establishment of the farm, could gather against one man the particulars of washed clothing and disputed movement, an inconsistent statement. What it could not do was pass from the narrowing of the field to the naming of the person, and the not proven verdict was, in its way, the exact expression of that failure, a finding that the field had been narrowed, but the person not named. The condition in which the verdict left James Crichton was one the Scottish law created, and the Scottish law alone, and it is worth marking precisely what that condition was, for it is central to why the case is remembered as it is. He was not a convicted man, and bore none of the disabilities of conviction, no sentence, no imprisonment, no forfeiture. He was not, in the full sense, an acquitted man either, for the verdict that freed him stopped short of the declaration that he had not done the deed. He occupied instead the particular middle ground the third verdict marks out, free in his person and unresolved in his name, a man of whom the law had said only that his guilt was not proven, and would now say nothing further, the door to a second trial being shut. The record of what became of him afterward is thin, and the Channel's practice is to leave it thin rather than to furnish it with invention. He passed out of the circuit court at Perth into a private life of which the documents preserve little, and the fuller course of his years is not established with the certainty that would allow its telling. What is established is the public fact that travelled with him, the verdict of not proven upon a charge of murder, a matter of record in the papers of the court and the columns of the press, neither a conviction to be served out, nor an acquittal to be relied upon, but the qualified freedom that the third verdict confers. For the family of Janet Rogers, the aftermath was the plainer and the harder thing, a killing among their own that the law had failed to answer. Her husband, James Rogers, the labourer to whom she had been married, and her 5 grown daughters, women of their own households, by the time of her death, were left with a loss that no verdict had explained and no sentence had requited. The brother, William Henderson, who had called her to Mount Stuart to keep his house, and who had returned from Perth Market to find her dead, was left with the killing done within his own farmhouse, and the man tried for it set free. Around them the parish went on, and the case receded from the daily life of the district into the longer keeping of memory and record, where it has remained. It remained there as an open matter, and the openness is the essential and the enduring fact of it. Most killings that reach a court reach also a resolution, a verdict that names or clears, a sentence that requites, or an acquittal that releases without qualification. The killing at Mount Stuart reached a court and did not reach a resolution. The verdict that closed the proceedings closed nothing else, and the question the proceedings had been convened to answer was returned unanswered to the record from which it had come. The documents state the question with all the precision the law could give it, and leave it exactly there, stated and unresolved, for whoever should come after to read. Those who came after read it in their several ways, and by reading kept it. The local retrospectives returned to it as one of the older mysteries of the county. The Scottish true crime and genealogical writing noticed it among the cases that the not proven verdict had left suspended. The descendant of the family who undertook the definitive modern study went back through the whole of the surviving record and set the case out with care, correcting the looser accounts, weighing the evidence as the documents allowed, and reaching the settled conclusion that the killing remains genuinely unsolved and that no person can be shown upon the record to have been its author. Through that labour, the case was consolidated and preserved, and the name of the woman at its centre was held against the silence. What that labour could not supply, and did not pretend to supply, was the answer. It could establish the facts, order the sequence, and mark with precision the point at which the evidence ran out. And in doing so, it performed the only service the record now permits, the service of keeping the question rightly stated. The killing of Janet Rogers in the kitchen of Mount Stuart Farm on the 30th of March 1866 is a thing the documents describe fully and account for not at all. They preserve the victim, the scene, the inquiry, the trial, and the verdict that closed the trial without closing the case, and they leave the hand that struck the blows where the jury of 15 left it, in the space beyond what the evidence would prove. The case of Janet Rogers was the last of these three cases to enter the historical record. The record was entered. No further legal proceedings followed. The record closed without resolution. Spite.